Start by saying we congratulate the new Biden administration, the new president. We obviously hope to have a good relationship, but this was a really terrible way to start on their part, which was to cancel a major project that a Canadian government co-owns that was being built based on U.S. approvals, and that is part of our $100 billion trade in energy with the United States. We have to stand up for ourselves, just like we did against Donald Trump's effort to rip up NAFTA and his unfair steel tariffs on Canada. We imposed countervailing tariffs. And if we don't stand up in a meaningful way here, I think it will embolden those American interest groups trying to landlock shut off all the Canadian energy pipelines to the U.S. So, look, for starters, we've asked the federal government to try to negotiate the future of Keystone XL in the context of continental energy and environmental policy, including climate policy. Secondly, at the very least, to demand a compensation for the investments that have been made based on U.S. approval of that project. And thirdly, potential targeted sanctions, similar to what was done with steel tariffs.
Well, those steel and aluminum tariffs were countervailing, as you said. They were retaliatory. Wouldn't this be escalating a situation?
No, since when did we Canadians think that the right response to aggression against Canada's economic interests is to surrender? That's not what Canada does. We need to stand up for ourselves. Look, there is under NAFTA the investor protection provision that was carried forward under CUSMA, the new agreement. And essentially what you have is a Canadian company, and in this case a Canadian government, that have spent together billions of dollars based on U.S. approvals, which have now retroactively been rescinded. That's not, that's a violation of our interests as investors, and at the very least some kind of compensation is required there. But here's my concern. The same folks who are opposed to Keystone XL want to decommission the Line 5 that takes 640,000 barrels a day of Alberta crude to Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario. And they're going to be emboldened. They're going to look at this as a potential tactic to use a presidential veto of that 60-year-old pipeline crossing the border, similar to Line 3 going to Minnesota and the upper Midwest. $100 billion of Canadian exports to the U.S. from our oil exports. To put that in context, we do about $40 billion in trade on auto parts. This is a very big deal. We cannot let this stand.
What is your government doing to help Enbridge with those two lines?
Well, we've been very active on that, and reaching out to decision makers in Michigan in the case of Line 5, working with the governments of Ontario and Quebec and the government of Canada. But you know, the governor there made an order to decommission the pipeline that I gather becomes effective in May, and the courts have encumbered that. But I can imagine there will be people who oppose the Line 5 who will now be on the phone to the White House saying use the presidential power to veto the border crossing. That's the concerning precedent that's been created. In terms of Line 3, that really is at the regulatory, final regulatory phase. So there's not much we can do in terms of advocacy. I have met with the governor of Minnesota, who is in favor of the project in principle, and I think Enbridge is very close to begin construction on the U.S. side.
Well, the Prime Minister is going to be talking with new President Joe Biden this evening. What are you hoping to hear out of that phone call that's going to convince you that things are going to need to be escalated here, that sanctions are going to be needed?
Well, at the very least, the Prime Minister needs to raise this, because we were very disappointed on the day that the President signed the executive order vetoing the border crossing retroactively, that the response from Mr. Trudeau's ambassador to Washington was that we need to accept this and move on. That's also what Minister Garneau from Global Affairs said. We never said, when Donald Trump campaigned to rip up NAFTA and impose steel tariffs, we didn't say we were going to accept that or respect that decision and move on. We stood up to it, and we should do so constructively. I understand we want to start a positive relationship. Prime Minister needs to be diplomatic. But if I were him, I would say, look, you know, Joe, we have a more ambitious climate plan than your administration, and that includes Keystone XL. Please show respect for Canada by at least sitting down and listening to our case about how we can take real climate action and strengthen North American energy security at the same time. Because if you don't, the message needs to go to the President that if not, it's going to move by rail, which according to the U.S. State Department's major study on Keystone will actually increase emissions. and they will be more dependent on OPEC dictatorships for future imports.
So you're simply asking the president to listen. Isn't that what he's doing later today?
Well, we'll see. But so far, the comments from the federal government were basically a white flag of surrender in what was clearly an attack against Canada's vital economic interests.
Do you think the Prime Minister wants to see the Canadian oil patch thrive and succeed?
Well, he certainly says he does. On the other hand, we've been combating a series of policies that have been damaging, including the cancellation of Northern Gateway, regulations that effectively killed Energy East, and so much more. But as I've said to Prime Minister Trudeau since the day I was elected, we want to find a way forward with his government that shows real serious progress on reducing carbon emissions, to demonstrate that Canada's energy sector can be one of the most responsible producers in the world. We already rank as the third highest ranked producer on environmental, social, and governance metrics. We've reduced carbon intensity from an average barrel of bitumen by 30% since the year 2000. We're on track to do that more. We're working with the federal government on a potential large-scale expansion of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology. So there are a lot of things that we can work on to improve our environmental performance and ensure a long-term future for an industry that employs directly and indirectly 800,000 Canadians.
Now, many have said 2 out of the 3 proposed pipelines would be good enough to see the oil sands and its growth in the future. Why is this one the hill to die on?
Well, our attitude is we need all of the above, and we have seen so many pipelines killed and canceled in such a large campaign, much of it foreign funded, to oppose all pipelines, including pipelines that existed for decades, that our view was we needed to pursue every possible alternative. And as you know, TC Energy had already invested over $6 billion before we became partners with them last March. And the refineries in the U.S., southern U.S., around Texas and Louisiana, are designed to process heavy crude, of which we have the largest, after Venezuela, we have the largest reserves in the world. So it actually makes enormous sense for both Canada and the United States that we should build that project.
Okay, I also have to ask you about the money on the line. Obviously, the Alberta government has invested $1.5 billion. You know, you have said you've had no regrets about that investment, but how can that be the case knowing that this was a bit of a long shot? We knew that Biden was opposed to this project.
Well, our government was elected on a mandate to fight for pipelines, to get pipelines built. Just as the federal government spent $7 billion on purchasing TMX, we felt that if we had not stepped in on this whole question about Keystone would have died last year, would become completely academic, and there would have been no construction. With our investment, we were able to create thousands of good jobs over the course of the past 9 months that supported the Alberta economy during this terrible downturn. We've been able to create facts on the ground and put forward a very compelling case. TC Energy engaging First Nations, major U.S. unions, coming forward with a carbon neutral plan for the operation of the pipeline. And in our latest polling, 70% of Americans support it. We were doing everything we can, as we were elected to do, to advance the cause of building pipelines. And I think any responsible Alberta government would have done the same thing. You
said you spoke to TC Energy's Russ Girling earlier this week. How are they seeing how this all unfolded?
Well, I'm sure they share our frustration. I mean, after all, they've been at this for over a decade, and have invested north of $6 billion over that time, assuming that the United States would have a predictable regulatory system. And so I understand, and in consultation with us, they've decided to suspend operations. We are going to sit down and review the actual, what our options are. Speaking for the Alberta government, we certainly intend to use every legal recourse available to us to demand compensation for this decision. We believe it's a violation of the investor protection provisions of NAFTA, which were carried forward under the new CUSMA trade deal.